Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Mariana, for sharing this. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us in our webinar today in a series of peace webinars on sustainable development in Africa, where we discuss important issues of peace and development across the world. And we meet also experts and scholars in these fields. In a special way, today we have our guest speaker, who is Professor Donna Pido. She's actually a familiar face to most of us who have been attending these webinars. And she is a participant. There is actually an echo for some reason. I don't know why. Sorry. And so, yeah, sorry about this. She's a regular participant and an author in one of the books that we expect soon. And she's now a speaker. She's a professor in the Department of Design at the Technical University of Kenya in Nairobi. And she studied anthropology at Columbia University in New York, in the US. So she will be taking us through a very important topic, which is identifying a fractal paradigm in the disruption of peace. We are going to know what a fractal paradigm is. And Donna, please, you are welcome. And after her speech, we will have some questions or comments to make, sharing our experiences. So you are all welcome. And please, if you're not speaking to us, mute your microphones so that we can have a better audibility. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming, and welcome, Donna Pido.
Thank you, George. Can we have the first slide?
Yeah, George, I think what happened is that both Dutting and I were unmade co-hosts, so we have no ability to share the slide at the moment, I think. I'm not sure.
And I have no possibility of sharing a slide because I have no slides anymore. We're trying to figure out if it's going to be possible to resuscitate my computer. So I don't even have, I don't have a copy of the PowerPoint.
Who has the presentation, George?
Okay, let me then forward to you and
to make him co-host. Who has it?
Dating, you have it, right?
George, several days ago, but
George, you're a co-host. You could share it.
Okay, perfect.
There it is.
There it is.
Yay!
Great.
So do I just go ahead now?
Yes, please.
Okay, the title is Observing a Fractal Paradigm in the Disruption of Peace. The next slide. Or can I manipulate the slides, or you have to do that for me? I want to go to the next. Okay, and I listened to a speech by Vladimir Putin on February 22nd, and I wanted to send you guys a copy, the transcript copy of that whole speech, but that was before my computer crashed, and now I don't have access to it. And neither do I have access to the link to that speech, but I will get it and send it to George as soon as I'm able to function on a real computer, not a Mac, excuse me, Mac users. So Vladimir Putin's speech to the international community on February 22nd brought up memories of similar scenes, conversation, and literatures. And here is where I have to put in that link. I'm sorry that I can't give it to you today. These prompted me to the investigation of typologies of violence. Now, I must make a disclaimer. This presentation is not about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th or the war that has followed. It is about a paradigm of justification that appears fractally at local and I can't see behind the people's pictures, fractally and at many levels, including the international level, all the way down to the interpersonal level. Next slide, please. Okay, the first scene, little girls in the laundromat. In about 1980, when I was still living in New York, I observed two sisters about 10 and 6 years old. Their mother had left them to mind the laundry in the dryer while she ran an errand outside. The younger girl was absorbed with her coloring book. She was doing nothing but coloring. The older sister came over to her several times, admonishing her for unseen misbehavior and threatening to spank her. Finally, she stated resolutely that she had no other option, and she spanked her little sister. As my laundry was dry,
Zawadi unayompa mwanaume ni zawadi gani? Let's say wazo la zawadi. Unataka kumpa mtu mzima mwanaume zawadi, unaweza kumpa zawadi.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Please
but had
proceed.
you heard me from the beginning? Okay, but you've read the text, it's okay. In
From the
about
beginning,
1980
yes, but there's some background noise.
Unaweza kukuta shati la
It's not here.
maana kwe. Au yale mashati ya
That's not even a language that I speak.
Yeah, please proceed. I can see somebody was talking in the background.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. Somebody needs to mute. So the idea is that there were these two little girls. They were sisters. One was bigger than the other. And when the mother left to go on an errand, the bigger girl suddenly started antagonizing the younger girl by threatening to spank her for misdemeanors or crimes that were not seen or were not being committed at that point, because the little girl was just coloring in her coloring book. In the end, the big girl came over and spanked the sister, explaining to her that she had no other choice but to spank her, considering all the bad things that she was doing. I left the scene because my laundry was dry, so I don't know what happened. But when I left, the big girl was standing over the little girl, looking smug and justified. Now, I'm connecting that scene. Next slide, please. I'm connecting that scene with some of the, may we have the next slide? Both the speech and the two girls remind me of women I have known who have recounted the lead up to physical abuse with justificatory threats and admonitions by their husbands, boyfriends, or stronger male relatives or caregivers. Their abusers made up stories or picked on trivial, unrelated matters as excuses for beating them. One claimed that the girls in his care were, quote, willful, thus forcing him to beat them. It was later revealed that he had set up an orphan care facility in Kenya to enable his abusive behavior because that was his pattern, and he was shut down and deported from Kenya. He was an American who came all the way here to build this facility so that he could create opportunities for himself for the physical abuse of young girls. Next slide, please. So this is a pathological syndrome, in my opinion. It's excuse for abuse. And that reminded me also of Hitler. And I'm looking now at various repeats of this paradigm at various levels. Then Hitler and the Sudetenland popped into mind, along with the Nazis' justifications for exterminating the Jews. This was in addition to many centuries of Christians' claims that Jews killed Jesus in order to justify occasional massacres of Jews. They were also somehow similar to the 10-year-old's threat, but on a much grander scale. So I went looking for a typology of violence and interpersonal abuse interpersonal abuse on the internet. And I found several from across the globe, along with a typology of spousal abuse. What we're seeing here is some Gestapo people in uniform escorting a bunch of Jews, possibly in Berlin, to be deported to the east, which really meant the extermination camps. And on the right, we're seeing a storefront the day after Kristallnacht. Is everybody muted, please? May I have the next slide? So I found from the government of Newfoundland, Labrador, a typology of 9 types of interpersonal violence: physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, spiritual, cultural, verbal, financial, and neglect. All of the above can be mixed and matched. You can have financial, sexual abuse, or cultural, emotional abuse, whatever. Next slide. So, and then I found Johnson's typology of intimate partner violence, IPV, in which he postulates 4 types of intimate partner violence. Intimate terrorism, meaning severe violence, is part of the perpetrator's coercive control and power and is primarily perpetrated by men, but not entirely. And I have written notes to myself here, AJ and wife. AJ was a prominent social scientist in Kenya, an American prominent social scientist in Kenya in the 1960s and 70s. O.J. Simpson is an example of this. The orphanage man who I just told you about, and Maasai men beating their wives with rungus. Rungus are clubs, knob carries in British English, and Maasai men deliberately, because it's forbidden in Maasai culture to do that, Maasai men deliberately beat their wives with clubs on the head to show how egregious their transgressions have been. And then I've written EA, I don't remember, oh, I know who that is. That's, never mind. That's just somebody at Took who threatens everybody that she's going to fire us to scare us anyway. And then there is situational couple violence, or SCV, in which one or both partners uses threats of controlling aggression. Intimate terrorism, IT, is a kind of violence that is part of a general pattern of control. Situational couple violence is part of that, but not the entire thing. Now, I find that I'm obscuring my own, is embedded in that general pattern. Violent resistance. There was a character in the novel Shogun, the female translator who falls in love with the British pilot of the shipwreck, and she was in the habit of forcing her husband to use violence in order to subdue her for sex. She refused to consent at all times. And then there is mutual violent control. This is rare, but it does occur. And I'm citing here a Maasai, a now late Maasai friend named Sam, who married an American woman who beat him up who beat him up in return when he beat her up. And I was told by a mutual friend, she gives as good as she gets. Next slide, please. we've gone back, or maybe I duplicated this slide. So my rationale is that I'm observing the same pattern of excuse for abuse occurring at several levels, all with similar violent results. I decided to find out more from the literature. What I found suggested that the interpersonal violence had not yet been adequately connected to the international scene, either historically or in the present. So we're looking at the level of the little girls in the laundromat, the married couples, the boss and employee, and various social relations in which violence takes place. But I have not found anything that links this interpersonal level through the chain of fractal sizes of scales of this type of violence all the way up to the international level. But I'm assuming that because I am not a veteran by any means of the peace studies field, and I'm assuming that all of you who are experts will know something or be able to identify a body of literature in which those connections are made all the way from interpersonal up to international. So my literature search has yielded very little, but I insist that there must be something out there that is known to people in other disciplines than my own. Next slide, please. So moving up to the international level, we can look at a typology of violence that includes military, economic, financial, commercial, plus all the interpersonal types of violence on a grander scale. And that's where we come to the concept of the fractal. If you look up the word fractal on the internet, we can go to that slide where it says, what is a fractal? I'm using the design definition of a fractal. A fractal is a repeat of a motif, pattern, or structure in smaller size than the original and often in descending order. We can reverse that definition. It's the next slide. We've finished with this one. Okay, a fractal is a repeat of a motif, pattern, or structure in smaller size than the original and often in descending order. You can do it the other way around also. For example, international violence, subnational violence, sectarian, school, class, neighborhood, generation, family, and one-on-one interpersonal violence. And I'm showing 3 illustrations of fractals here. On the left, there's the triangle, and then within the triangle are smaller triangles, and smaller than that, and smaller triangles. So the single triangle is a fractal of the big triangle, but they're all exactly the same shape and proportions, if not dimensions. Next to that, we see a tree in which the branches are fractals of the trunk, and the first split, which looks like it's about 30 degrees. And then each of those branches in a split at about 30 degrees, and each subsequently all the way out to the very fine, tiny branches of the tree. This is a fractal arrangement in which the motif is repeated in diminishing size throughout. And then the 3 pictures that you see on the right show a fractal of a house. The first picture is a New England clapboard house somewhere in New York State, which is a normal size in which people live, a family exists. And on the upper right, the pink house that you see, you can just barely see the little girl with a watering can in front of it. That is a children's playhouse, which is a fractal of the large size human house. And then below that, we see 2 images of a doll's house, which is the smallest of the 3 in the fractal series. On the left of that picture at the lower right, we can see a New England clapboard house, similar to the one that I showed for people living in it. And then the inside, that is a doll house. It sits on a table, and you can see the inside of that house, which is a fractal of both the children's playhouse and the full-sized human house. Let's go to the next slide. So what I'm seeing is the same motif repeated all the way down. And now I'm taking some excerpts from Putin's speech of February 22nd, and I had extrapolated these from the text, and I'm just, I have put some in red, fundamental threats, necessary, ensuring the security of Russia. We have been patiently trying. The insolent manner, our legitimate demands, humanitarian catastrophe, international terrorism and extremism, degradation and degeneration. We made yet another attempt. Our efforts were in vain. I have told you not to do that, little Susie. And here we are in the laundromat, and I'm going to have to spank you in public if you don't stop. Next slide. Yeah, and these are even more so. We have no right to make this mistake again. In other words, I'm not going to let you get away with what you're doing. I tried and it didn't work. We cannot stay idle. They have crossed it, the red line. It became impossible to tolerate it. We had to stop that atrocity. Defending ourselves, we had no other choice. This little sentence, we had no other choice, is sort of the kernel or the crux of this type of threat. Sacrifices our people have made to defeat Nazism are sacred, so we have to uphold them. We could not act otherwise. We are acting to defend ourselves. Let's go to the next slide. So these are all quotes from Putin. The bottom line is that the West, oh, we're going to see the whole slide now. Yeah, he is in this speech, he is letting us know he's setting himself up with several characteristics as a dramatization. He is helpless in the face of attack. Hostile outside forces compel him to act in defense, to protect himself and other victims. He has no other choice. He is upholding the right and good. He is acting on behalf of a greater population and the greater good. The severity of his actions is justified by the egregious assault. Russians and Ukrainians share a common history and common interests. The West is hostile, thoughtless, and rude. Therefore, it's okay for him to invade and destroy Ukraine, which he did 2 days later after this speech. Next slide, please. The observation that I'm making is that it appears that there is a certain consistency and transferability of the intimate terrorism model at all levels. Putin was conforming to the pathological pattern of a well-known of a well-known type of domestic abuser, but was applying the model to a neighboring country and an association of countries. Next slide, please. So what can we do? If this is really an insight, as I think it is, what can we do with this insight? Leaving aside all that has happened as Russia prepared to invade Ukraine and all the damage that has been done, and I might add the threats of the last week or so for the use of nuclear weapons, I have focused on the pathological paradigm of self-justification in preparation for premeditated attack and harm of a close associate. This is important in our collective and individual studies of peace and the processes that build, reinforce, and also twist and destroy peace. Are there other fractal paradigms we should identify in peace studies? Who has a literature on this one? Please help me find any and all literature that I can look at and use to inform, and please tell me if people already know about all this and I'm just talking nonsense. I think that's the last slide, except for the references on the final slide. Oh. Okay, you can figure out what that means. Next slide, thanks for watching. And now here are some of the references that I was able to put in before my computer dropped dead. So with that, I think we can open it up to discussion.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Donna Pido, for taking us through this very important fractal paradigm and the excuse of abuse and self-justification, etc. And with these examples from Putin, etc., or his excerpts. So I would like to welcome participants for questions, comments, and sharing of experiences. And I'm sure that somebody will be able to answer some of your questions as well, Donna, about the literature. So thank you very much indeed. Right. And of course, also please feel free to, turn your cameras on so that we can see you if you wish, because that also is important. So if you wish, please feel free to, so that we can see you. And yeah, please, Lester Kurtz, please.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening. That was really fascinating. Appreciate that perspective. And this is something I've been interested in for a long time. In fact, one of the most I put in the chat box, one of the most helpful studies that I have seen on this sort of link between interpersonal and international transnational violence. There's Randall Collins has a book called, I think it's called Violence, a Micro-Sociology, Micro-Sociological Approach. And what he did was he tried to find different ways of looking at actual scenes of violence. And he also compared like what happens in movies with what happens in real life. And for example, and one of his conclusions is that actually violence is hard. Violence is hard to do. And so in fact, like fist fights, for example, in real life are not sort of drawn out like they are in the movies. In fact, there's a lot of effort by people not to actually engage in a conflict or a physical conflict. So there's lots of blustering and name calling and moving and that sort of thing. The difficulty of this is also, of course, even international violence is carried out by individuals. So I really liked your effort to look at what Putin was doing, what he was saying, compared to what he was doing, right? And trying to look at some of these links between interpersonal and international. I also put a link to an old book that I co-edited with Jennifer Turpin on the web of violence, and that book emerged out of a conversation with her when she was my teaching assistant for a course I was teaching on nuclear war, on the nuclear threat, and she was doing her research. She was doing her research on her master's degree on sexual assault. And we were looking at some of the parallels between the nuclear arms race and sexual assault issues. And I think that there are really there's a lot to uncover here. And we really don't understand some of those links. and also how applicable micro level analysis is to macro level and vice versa. So I think you've really helped a lot with that big puzzle we have. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, which I did not put into the slide presentation, is there anything, how does this insight into this particular paradigm, how can it inform interventions to prevent war or prevent interpersonal violence or sectarian violence? I'm just wondering if something came up last week at the Technical University where the administration is concerned about gender abuse among staff, particularly, it's not always males, but it's more often than not males, now making sexual advances at females or propositions or holding up processes in return for sex. And they were asking, what can we do to stop this? And the response to that was that, in East Africa, you have to intervene in early childhood because boys are trained in the traditional initiation system. They are trained to be violent toward females. So when they get to be 35 or 40 years old, what can we expect? So would a childhood intervention have stopped Putin from doing what he has done? That I'm not placing any judgment on it, but he looks a little bit silly to me, particularly since he's now threatening the use of nuclear weapons against, the Eastern European countries. Is this his pattern? And does he do this to his wife? What about his daughters? And so if we can know something about this, will it help anybody, particularly people concerned with peace at the international level? Can it help us to develop interventions that will mitigate the situation? I don't know if that makes any sense. Other people. Oh.
Janet, please. Oh, yes, please. You are muted.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for your patience. I really, really loved your presentation. Thank you. I think that it used to be, I have several things to say. It used to be that people said, no. Psychological doesn't apply to the grand and international. So it's very wonderful for you to bring up a re-examination of that. A second thing is that I also paint and I love art, and I can't remember who this is, but one of the I think African-American women activists has used this word fractal to describe how to use facilitation to get at these systemic issues like racism and misogyny. And I'm looking at my desk, but it may be later that I find this reference. But you, unlike this writer, never explained fractals. You explained it so well. So thank you for that definition. I'm really grateful. And the third thing is, with my cohort of Dale Snowert, some people working on the peace education and peace studies work from a more political theory view, have been using the work of Rainier Forst, a German, very, he follows the work of both he was a student of both John Rawls working on justice and Habermas working on communicative dimensions of justice and trying to put those together. And he calls what your Putin's speech arbitrary justification. Now, arbitrary means it's not grounded in reason. It's not grounded in reality, like the scene of the girls in the laundromat. It's a narrative that the speaker makes up to self-justify, as you say so nicely, but
Yes.
there's no validation. So for example, with our former president, Trump, one of the ways that, two ways that his lies and illegitimate, well, he didn't even really try to justify, he just spewed out this nonsense. So one thing the newspapers did was to, for everybody's speech, they they listed what was a lie and what was the truth, you know, and they gave references. So that was one example of countering arbitrary or illegitimate, I call it illegitimate narratives. And another one was humor. And a lot of people in the Ukraine where, you know, this aggression has been going on, this fight in a way, is also to look at the lead ups, you know, because his speech was the turning point before attacking, his justification for attacking, sorry. But the lead up, the problems in the Ukraine have been going on since the 2003 revolution. And people use humor and everyday objects like loaves of bread, pictures of loaves of bread and flowers to counter in a metaphoric way so that the population shares another way of thinking about it. So thank you for my long, I hope that was
Thank you
helpful.
so much. That
Yeah, I
helps me
really
a lot.
appreciate what you say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And please, Joseph.
Yes, good greetings, everyone. I'm audible.
Hello.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Pido, for the brilliant, I thought it was a brilliant presentation, and I loved the topic. It made me like, okay.
I think there is a connection problem with Joseph's internet connection. Can you hear me, Joseph? Joseph, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So please, could you start?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Proceed.
Yes, I was saying, I think humans don't want to identify as evil. And so before we do a thing that we know is evil at some level, we try to look for a justification. So I love that you pointed that out in Putin's speech, because I also noticed it with some of my friends, like before they do something bad, they look for some kind of justification so that they can feel better about it. So that they need to feel confident in what they're trying to do, even though they know it's bad. They just need anything to give them that peace. Like even villains are looking for peace of mind, that I've realized. So I think your presentation, what you're talking about, it helps us. It can help us identify. It can help us identify a mind that's inclining towards chaos. Yes, I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry about all the breaks and everything.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment, Joseph.
Have we exhausted all discussion?
They are in the making.
Okay.
Yes, Les would like to say something. Thank you, Les.
Yeah, since there's a gap, let me jump back in. I've been talking too long, and so I cut myself off. But there's another really important point I've found in trying to think about these things is that there's a cost, and I was reminded this by what Joseph was saying. There is a cost, psychological cost for doing damage to people, for harming people. And we know PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And the American military has been dealing a lot with this because so many soldiers returning from all of the wars over the last few decades have had terrible psychological problems because of this issue. And there's another. I'll put a link in. There's another. There's work by Rachel McNair, she's a psychologist who coined the term perpetrator-induced traumatic stress, and this is actually in the DSM, like the psychological manual for diagnoses from the American Psychological Association, and it looks at this whole issue of how people pay a high cost for engaging in violence against other people. This part of what this actually, Rachel wrote a chapter for a book that Lee Smithy and I did on the paradox of repression. In thinking about, because we were looking at sort of questions of repression, and Rachel talked about how the police and security forces are also facing this issue. And it's helpful for activists to know about it. So it may be, potential victims of violence, if they know that the perpetrator is paying the cost, that there may be a way of connecting to them that might help reduce the possibilities of violence. Of course, this is more easily said than done. But I remember Dave Grossman. I don't know if any of you know Dave Grossman. He's a really fascinating and ambivalent character who actually does training for the military and combat research. And he also talks about this cost, the cost to the perpetrator, and how the military has tried to overcome that in their training. And I once heard him doing a lecture at the Peace Studies meeting, and he was asked a question by one of the students. So what do I do if someone's pointing a gun at me? And he said, look them in the eye, because if they see you as human, it's more difficult for them to harm you. Of course, again, that's more easily said than done. I've as a safe white male, it's awkward for me to tell, I won't tell people to do that, but that's, maybe something to try to figure out what to do with that, what I consider a fact about the problem of doing violence to other people.
That's interesting to me because I was once confronted at gunpoint by a person who I couldn't look in the eye because he had a black stocking over his head. And he shot my companion, who survived. But it would be nice to have been able to look that guy in the eye. All I can do is scream. And so I screamed and woke up the whole neighborhood, but that didn't help. But the guy ran away, leaving a fingerprint behind. And he later spent 8 years in a New York slammer for that little goodie. But it's interesting that he says, look the person in the eye if you can. Excuse me. More. Who wants to say something else? Or you can continue, please. Lester, don't leave us flat like this. You seem to be the guy who knows a lot more, certainly, than I do.
No, I just talk a lot. Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, part of the issue here is figuring out how we do. I like the fact you brought up the intervention issue. So the question is, how do we scale up? And I say, I'll be quick because Janet has her hand up. She probably has something better to say than I do. But how do we scale up the analysis, right? If we know that the individual is about to pay a cost. I also, the other thing, I look at religion and violence. So religion is really helpful. This is why, you know, Trump had to go clear out Lafayette Square protesters and go hold the Bible up at the church. You know, of course he turned the Bible upside down, literally and metaphorically. I love the fact that he made that point, because he was turning the Bible upside down his entire tenure as president. But you know, if we can figure out how to look at this fact, when people are going to harm others, they have to come up with a good reason, like Joseph was saying, and this is where oftentimes religious arguments come into play, because, you know, if I'm harming others in the name of God or some higher purpose, that helps me excuse myself. It helps relieve the guilt that I'm going to have from engaging in harmful activity. So
I tried that once on a Nairobi cop who had pulled me and my friend over, and he was demanding a bribe, or he was going to take us to the police station. And I noticed something about him, and I said, I see that you're wearing a ring with a picture of the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's very good. And he said, yes, she's very wonderful. And I said, would she approve of what you're doing right now? Do you think Guadalupe would want you to demand a bribe from two people driving a car? And he said, no, but we had to pay anyway. So we.
Thank you very much. And Janet, please, would you like to make a comment?
It's me, okay, Mariam also has something.
I put.
Oh, okay.
Oh, someone else go.
Yeah.
What?
So
I have a question about
Yes.
when you commit the act of violence for the greatest good. I mean, how you put it, the utilitarian dilemma, like I'm doing something for others. I'm killing this person for the good of many. How you put it is the greatest number for, Alex, can you help me with that? Great utilitarian thing, right?
yeah, the greater good for the greatest number. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
You might commit something, a violence, maybe kill somebody in order to protect a larger number of people. Maybe this person could. So what you have to, can you say something about that as a justification of violence?
Me, I can't say anything about anything. I see a pattern, but I don't know what it's all about. Lester or maybe Janet or somebody else can say, yeah, what is that about? I agree with the question, but I don't have an answer for it. It's part, to me, it looks like part of the self-justification. You know you're going to kill the person, or you know you're going to beat him or her up. And so you have to make up a story to make it sound acceptable. I don't know. You guys know better than I do.
All right, let's, Janet, please. And yes, Janet, please.
You have three big talkers here. So what we've done with the work of Rainier Forest, he says that justification is, that justice is based on justification. But justice can't be only the justification. It can't be removed from the web of, well, I would say the web of relationships that we're continually working and connecting, and with the moral grounding of that web of relationships, and that the moral grounding comes from what, this is Scanlon, what could nobody else, we're looking for a congruence of opinion. Now Putin just goes off, or Trump, they go off on their own. They've got into a grandiose high level of domination where they're no longer answering to any relationships, in my opinion. But we, as the ordinary people, have to keep pointing out and grounding the harm of justifications. And so I think you're referring the less, like we are sometimes in the position of picking the lesser evil, but this greatest good for the greatest number. Well, who says? Who says it's the greatest good? And shouldn't we be including everyone? I mean, especially now in this, it seems to me there's a rising up of this global, a sense of our interconnectedness globally. We can't just go off and kill the neighbors because they're not part of our town, our village, our language, our religion, because we see much more how we're connected. And that's something we all need to, I think, emphasize. We know now a nuclear weapon will harm the whole world, a nuclear war. We also know that just the war itself is harming the environment, not to mention all those people who are traumatized by having their lives completely destroyed, interrupted, their relationships broken.
Can I interject something? You know, Janet, you're reminding me of my childhood. And the idea of justification, Eliseu has said, would it have been better if the Ukrainians had just maintained silence to those provocative words of Putin? And I'm wondering what good would silence have done? But I want to tell a story about when I was a kid, my mother and all her friends went to a Jewish doctor. This was in Long Island, New York. They all went to the Jewish doctor, and we were told that Jews don't believe in God. And I asked her, so why do you go to a Jewish doctor? And she said, because we all know that if we get pregnant and we're having a baby and there's a problem, the Jewish doctor will save us, but a Catholic doctor in a Catholic hospital would save the baby and let the mother die. This was in the 1940s, mind you. It has changed, I think. But so their justification for seeing a Jewish doctor was that, of course, the Jews don't believe in God, so it's okay. Does that make any sense? That's another justification of, I can't call it violence, but an excuse for doing something that was against their religion, and everybody survived.
Wonderful. We are doing well.
I don't know, I'm probably offending everybody here.
We are following your explanation,
So wait,
Donna.
Eliseu, what could have prevented, when it was only 2 days before Putin invaded Ukraine, how silent would the Ukrainians have had to be in order to stop that invasion? Because they didn't do anything. They didn't have time even to respond to Putin's speech. What could they possibly have done to defuse him?
Good question. And maybe as Eliseu is thinking about that, if we could go to Joseph, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I was thinking justifications sound like manipulations. It's almost like the person who's giving the justification has already decided what he wants to do. And so now he's trying to get everybody else behind him, So it's like the one where they say, if we kill these few, the greater number will survive. So they try to make you feel like this group doesn't matter and the bigger group matters. And then that's the energy we move in, like we execute everything in. So I think what we need to learn is to dispel the justification as it's happening. First, we need to be able to identify it as it's happening, see where the person is inclining in their speech. And then if it seems like, if we can see the danger, we see how to attack it before it actually happens, how to pull it from the root, because justifications that go without a challenge, they seem like they have a founding, like they have a foundation. And then the person will just proceed and then we'll cry at the end like, oh man, we didn't do anything. But the truth is because we ignored, when the person was speaking, we ignored that, we didn't attend to it, yeah.
Interesting. Very good.
Yes, lovely.
Buno tebusobola kwogererako ddala. N'okuwulira.
Ronald, have you got a question to us?
Sema Ronald.
Can you hear us, Ronald? Okay, well, he's muted.
Hello.
Yes, proceed, please.
Are you hearing me, Doctor?
Yes, I am.
I extend my appreciations to the webinar presenter today and also apologize for late coming, but the network has also contributed to that. I humbly request any webinar participant to kindly give me a brief of the entire presentation. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Actually, what we will do, we will send you we'll ask Donna Pido to give us the PPT so you can go through it, which is really self-explanatory.
I can't send it to Ronald until I get a computer, so you're free to send it. Okay,
Right.
I give
Thank
you
you
my
very
permission.
much.
Okay.
Thank you. I will do that. I will do that with joy. Thank you.
Okay. Ronald, don't worry.
And I'm trying to see in the chat box whether there is something there to comment on.
Somebody has said lesser evil.
Yes.
I don't know whose
icon
that is. But does the question of evil even come into it? Eugene, Wirpa, where are you? Eugene. Speak to us.
Okay, hey. I'm right here. I'm right here in Nairobi. Yeah, it goes with, I was thinking about the just word theory, where sometimes violence is justified, that this was done for the greater good. But I think even the advocates of the just word theory are moving away from it, because you can never really justify violence. As you have rightly said, Professor, that we are all interconnected. But of course, if you find a thief breaking into your house, you have to do something before they do harm to you. So I was just trying to capture the essence of what she was trying to say, that sometimes you are doing something for the good. I think there is logic to it, and there is every reason for us to do something. But as Joseph rightly mentioned, it can be manipulated at the state or international level, like we have rightly seen from your presentation with Putin, trying to justify this violence. So I really like that connection. Myself, I teach conflict transformation. I was really impressed to see that fractal structure to connect what happens at the interpersonal level right to the international level. And as we say, peace begins, if we are to have a peaceful society, it has to begin with us. Thanks for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Great. And Eliseo, you wanted to say something, right? Are you still there? Eliseo?
Oh, yes, Dr. George, I'm there.
Please proceed.
Yes. Sorry, I would like first to thank the presentation, which was wonderful. I really loved it. And I just have a small maybe question, I would say, on the way we took the discussion. And I loved the part where the presenter brought the excerpt of the speech. And for me, I just thought that sometimes violence comes from action and reaction, just as we wrote the message. Because if one is, let's suppose family violence, domestic violence, if one person, one member of the family is violent and talks and is very pressing on talking, if the other person doesn't talk, it is true that there will be violence, but violence will be getting over and over as you see the other person does not react. But also on the other side, there is this issue of the violence itself being a part of the history of the family, because maybe it starts from somewhere where outsiders do not understand. You may say something that an outsider will not understand what is the reach of what was said. But you, as part of the family, since the presenter was saying that one of the speeches was saying there are two brother or sister countries, which means they have some patterns of issues brought into discussion, which they would both understand better than outsiders. And maybe that would be part of the discussion also of all those extracts that were taken from the speech, were some of them well understood by the neighboring country or they were not? Are they part of an historical background that they share or they are not? Could we only stop in the speech, or there are more elements which are not evident in the speech that could be taken into consideration? So I think that analyzing the speech alone could not be enough to bring about conclusions which may lead us to judge if that is enough to justify violence or not. Because I was trying to look at it from my perspective. I am in Mozambique. Those speeches, those excerpts of the speech, for us here, may be spoken by a neighboring country like Tanzania or Zimbabwe or South Africa. We could choose an attitude to or just listen to them and ignore or answer. So when you come to a point of answering them, that could be a different stage of either triggering violence or solving the problem. So how are the answers which were given to those experts? So maybe from some knowledge I get from the hermeneutics, it says that the interpretation has got its meaning, has got its weight in the discussion, but also context has also have its own meaning to bring in the context. So maybe I would like to hear from the speaker if a few of these concerns that I raised in my speech could have maybe some reasonable answer. Thank you, Dr. George, and thank you, the speaker.
Thank you for that comment. My first reaction is to ask, what does justify violence? I lived for many years in Masailand, and I knew women who became desperate by 2 o'clock in the afternoon because they didn't have enough money to buy sugar for their husband's tea. And they knew that when they got home, they would be beaten if there was no sugar in the tea. What justified that violence? That's one question. And I have another one. Oh, yes. The American justification of invading Afghanistan and Iraq, not Iran. I don't think we've invaded Iran since the 50s, but even then, I don't think we did that. What about it? Why has nobody done anything about the American propensity for invading other people's countries and changing governments and killing leaders who have without any justification? What is the level of culpability that justifies violence against an individual, a group, a country, What is that? What justifies a Maasai husband for beating his wife because she has no sugar for his tea? What are we talking about here? And is there ever any justification for violence?
We're talking about
power. And may I add just quickly, I used to work for a Quaker college in Kenya, and I thought, this is just wonderful. The Quakers are totally nonviolent. And over a period of several years, I discovered that Quakers have their own form of violence. They are violent. They don't hit anybody, but they are violent among themselves, at least in that institution. It was called Friends World College. It is defunct now. But what amazed me about that experience was that I discovered Quaker violence.
Thank you very much. Yes, Janet, please.
I think that we're using the word justification too loosely. If we use it to mean what somebody says and we accept it at that, I think that's not the kind of justification that that doesn't say anything about the moral value and the relational impact. But if we put justification within the context of how it impacts other people, the implications, then I think it has some meaning. And I think and so that's one point. And the second point is we have to keep it connected to the moral relational impact on others to get a viable, not just an arbitrary justification. And the second point is that Elijah, I think you would pronounce your name, points out that all of these things need more context. There's his historical context, relational context, social context. Who says there's any justification at all for husbands beating their wives? You know, where does that come from? Isn't that something we can question? But how do we disrupt it? I think that's the question you want to ask. How do we disrupt socially accepted violence? Does that make sense?
That's a key. Thank you. How do we disrupt it? We may not be able to prevent it, and we may not be able to change it, but we can disrupt it. But how? If even disruption is possible. Good question. The other thing I would add after what you've just said, Janet, is that justification, is there any objectivity in justification? Or is it a totally subjective matter? I think somewhere in the Bible it says, revenge is only for the Lord. And if we talk about historical or histories of interpersonal or intergroup violence, at what point does history justify violence? When, particularly in a Christian community where violence is the preserve of the government in a secular society, and where you're told specifically not to take revenge, to turn the other cheek, and that vengeance is only for the Lord. Da, 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 da. What justifies it?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I was wondering whether, Bill, maybe you'd like to make a comment or your reflection on our discussion today. Bill Hidley?
I see Bill, but we haven't heard from him yet, and I've been wondering why.
Yeah, well,
Oh.
thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. I think I'll just pay attention for now. I got in a little late, and I'm just trying to listen to the commentary, but thank you for the offer.
Thank you very
So
much
type
indeed,
up whenever
Bill.
you have something to say. We want to hear from you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so we will get back to Bill maybe later. And Nick, please. You are muted, Nick. You are muted.
Okay, sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself, but okay. Yeah, thank you for this fantastic discussion and presentation. The presentation, of course, to our presenter, but for the discussion for everybody. This is really a fantastic group today. It's always a fantastic group, but today there's fantastic interaction. So about both the justification for violence and also what we can do to counteract this legitimation of violence. I think both of this is related to a lack of awareness. I think what is happening here is perhaps that we're too much focused only on the issue, and I think there's the saying of you can't see the forest for all of the trees, or the other way around, one of those. I think the issue here is really a lack of awareness, and that is what both on the one hand breeds violence, but then also allows people to give themselves permission to execute violence. And into this round of very aware people, I would like to pose this question: how could we promote more awareness? I think perhaps as a way to counteract this unawareness. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
by
Nick.
whom?
Right. How to promote this awareness.
How, by whom, and in what contexts? I would add. Somebody else.
I would say, I would then ask by everybody. In what context? In every context. Again, kind of asking these questions, and I'm sorry for possibly not understanding and fully grasping your questions, but to me it seems like simply asking these questions, how, by whom, and in what context, is again limiting the possibility of what might be capable through awareness. So not have it only so much issue-based, but a more general approach of promoting universal or awareness all around, right? Where we're not being put into simple boxes of color of skin or of gender, of age, of this or that, but just to promote an all-around awareness is what I'm thinking. Sorry if that.
I cannot agree with you more, but I guess my question boils down to, where does it start? You said something very excellent in the chat when you said there is no justification for violence, only excuses. That I thought that summarized everything very, very well. But if we're going to try to do something about it, whatever it is, where do we start? Where does anybody start?
That's an excellent question. I think the only place that I could start is within myself, right? And how could we promote for everybody to start within themselves. What kind of questions would everybody have to ask of themselves to arrive at a higher or a more inclusive awareness? I think we're asking the same question, actually.
Yeah, we are. And neither of us is really able to answer it very well. I'm seeing a picture now of some lovely cactus plants. Have we ended? Looks like it.
That should be, I think that's a mistake from one of the participants. So please, let's proceed. And yeah, it's a nice one. It's a nice one for sure. Maybe that's where we have to start.
Yeah, we can start right there.
Yeah, to promote non-violence and this kind of unjustified,
Lester, grateful. Thank God Lester is raising his hand again, because we always benefit from everything that Lester has to share. Maybe we have to start with Lester.
Les, please, I can't actually see people who are raising their hands now for some reason. But please, Lester, if you could continue.
Pressure's on now, Nick. Thank you for your kind words. Well, I'm thinking about, how do we undo the message, the messaging, and where do we start? And I think, first of all, each of us has a niche, right? Because we all have ways of communicating with people, and in fact, a lot of us are educators, so we have the classroom and so on as a place to begin. But I think also there's because we have to scale up the intervention as well as scaling up the analysis, right? So we have real ambivalence about violence. I think most cultures do. We have peaceful cultures that are very, very peaceful, very anti-violent, but most cultures, I think, have both a pro and anti-violence message that gets disseminated throughout the culture in the ways that all values do. So there are certain institutions, there are narratives and stories that people get socialized into, where as someone's pointed out, that young people get taught that they need to use violence, and this is, it used to be that the values were sort of the way I like to think of it. Values were communicated through stories at the local level, right, in the village, right, by elders. You sit around a campfire and elders would tell stories that have moral meanings, implications for your life. Then we have religious leaders as religion becomes more institutionalized, religious leaders, then we hand it over to the state. But now I think we have stories by prophet, right? Most of our media, I think a lot of our education comes through the stories that are told in the entertainment media, video games, and all that sort of thing. And a fundamental message there is if you have a real problem, you have to be ready to use violence to solve it. And that seems to be a really basic message, in so much entertainment media. And so maybe part of what we have to do in addition to our sort of personal education, our personal narratives, where we look for alternatives to violence, and we talk about how these incredible successes of nonviolence, and the efficacy of nonviolent communication at an individual level or nonviolent action at a collective level. But also we need to begin being more strategic about changing the message of these for-profit stories that are teaching people the necessity of using violence. There are basically two messages. One is you have to use violence for big problems. The other one is you can solve anything by going out and spending money. Those are sort of the two big messages of that we're getting from the entertainment media.
We're also not yet considering structural violence. If there are any African Americans here, they know that in the 1930s, under the Roosevelt government, when Social Security was incepted, begun, whatever, agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from eligibility for Social Security payments, for Social Security, for participation in the Social Security system. That was structural violence against Black people because most of those workers were Black. And then you may or may not know this, but in the 1970s, some social scientist whose name I don't know discovered that Black people were dying on average at the age of 63, when the age of eligibility to collect Social Security benefits was 65. So the Blacks were paying into a pot that whites were benefiting from. And then if you were Black and you died before your eligibility, your survivors didn't get any benefits at all. That's yet another kind of violence, which is not what we're talking about right now. But if we're going to talk about physical or kinetic violence, let's say bombs and that sort of thing, we also have to be considering structural violence and the justifications that are used for structural violence. It's a big topic, chimeric.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Donna and everyone. I'm wondering whether there is another question here. I can't see a hand or a question in the chat box.
Make a comment?
Yes, please.
Yes, I like that, the last part. You are talking about, I think, to connect violence with the systemic violence, with the structural violence, with the violence that happen at individual level. I think is significant, and I'm trying to process that, but I feel there's a link between, in many ways, right? The actors and individual, because when we talk about the system, who is a system? System are individuals are involved, the structures in the system, but actors are us.
Mm.
Actors are human. They're acting within those structures to perpetuate those kind of violence, justified violence. So maybe I think, Les, you might have more, might articulate that better. I see that there is connection there, and structure. I don't know, but that's a very good point you raised. I'm trying to process it. Let's see, you have.
Me too. You're not alone.
Yes.
Can I talk again? I'm talking too much, but
no, you're not.
I think the Johann Galtung's violence triangle was I think one of our major paradigm shifts in thinking about violence, because we do. I mean, even today our discussion is mostly about direct violence, right? But even when you think about this action reaction notion that Joseph and others have brought up, this kind of reciprocity issue, sometimes like structural violence or cultural violence lead to direct violence. So that when we see the direct violence, It's in fact partly a response to other kinds of violence, structural or cultural. And I posted a thing in the chat box about I should post a link to my paper so in case anybody wants to see it. But I've added eco-violence to Galton's triangle, violence against the environment. And initially I thought it was one way, humans doing violence to the environment. But now since the pandemic, I realize the violence is, the nature is also reciprocating the violence, with the pandemic, the virus, that's kind of a response to our violence against nature. But at any rate, that's, I think part of this whole complex matter of the macro level that all of our, and I love the concept of karma. One last thing, and then I'll be quiet. The concept of karma, also helps me to link micro and macro level. It's good sociology, karma, because every thought, word, and deed has consequences, right? Every thought, word, and deed has consequences, and it ripples out, right? So that everything I do has consequences. Then the consequences have consequences, which have consequences, which have consequences. So it's kind of an exponential reaction to everything that I do and everything that everybody around us is doing, right? Because we're all collectively shaping our environment. So every act of harm results in multiple acts of harm, which have multiple acts of harm. So we're constructing a harmful environment. Every act of compassion helps to construct a compassionate environment as the compassion ripples out. And so this is part of I think this connection between micro level and macro level. I said I was going to keep quiet, didn't I? Here I am rambling on.
Keep going.
One quick story, which is kind of self-serving. There's a Tibetan monk once. There's a group of Tibetan monks came to give us kind of a cultural performance in Austin, Texas, and I was backstage with them because I got to introduce them. And I asked the photographer to take my picture with the monks. I said, made a big mistake. I spent 45 minutes interviewing the Dalai Lama, but I didn't get my picture with him. And one of the monks said, no, what's much more important is that your karma is intertwined with the Dalai Lama's. And I said, yes, that really helps my karma. But it started me thinking about how our karmas are intertwined. And so in fact, all of us here in this webinar, now even we can get our karmas intertwined virtually, thanks to the internet. And so every thought, word, and deed that we share with one another, even in a webinar, expands the ripples of our thoughts, words, and deeds.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Les. I would like to go to Janet, and I think she will complete and conclude our webinar for today. Thank you very much, Janet. And
okay,
please.
Let me get rid of this hand. Oh, I can do it later. Okay, thank you. I love what you said, Lester, because you bring together the context, the impacts of personal action affecting others. And lately I've been asking, after years of studying this stuff, I've been asking, I think we're working on empowerment, we're working on thinking, analysis, so many things that people have mentioned, and taking responsibility for interventions. But lately I've been thinking about our problem-solving model and how there are many problems we can't solve. You and I, us, this group or that group. Like, we can't just solve the environmental problem. We can't solve what happened in Ukraine because of all the actors, some of which we see and some of which for example, the weapons industry profiteering, we don't see. It's not in the news. We don't get that. So So I leave us with this question. How can we think more deeply together about interventions in the problems which can't be addressed by our best problem-solving capacities? How do we do that? How do we think about that? And I love this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Pido, for stimulating it, for George and Egan and Lester for bringing us together.
May I
Wonderful.
say
Thank you
one more
very
thing
much.
before we close? Thank you, Janet. And my big question, because I'm involved in curriculum development, which I don't really like very much. How do we write this into what you just said? You're absolutely right. How do we write it into our curricula, and which curricula? Family curricula, primary K through 12, undergraduate, certificate, diploma, degree, master's, PhD, How do we write all this into the curricula and implement? That's all I have to say. Thank you, everybody.
Very good question. Very good question, Donna, and thank you very much indeed. Actually, we have a presentation on schools and curriculum in the next few weeks, so probably be able actually to expound on that. And we definitely keep on thinking about all these great ideas that we've heard today, because the challenge is for us to promote peace and non-violence in the world and amongst ourselves, of course, and our communities. And as I pointed out at the beginning of this webinar, that Donna Pido wrote a chapter in a book that we are all actually looking forward to, and I hope that will be coming out soon. On top of that, we have decided also to write another one based on the presentations that we make. So all these wonderful ideas are going to be in a handbook published by Springer, most probably. So I would like to call upon you, please, to write your chapters and send them to me, and then we'll proceed with the review, etc. So thank you very much indeed, Donna, and thank you very much indeed, everybody, for participating. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
My husband is reading now. He can talk. I don't know how to get out of the meeting, however. Oh,
all right.
Macs are crazy. Everybody should use a PC. You click on the X